thing that you hear a lot about it in the Dutch culture, and that is the Golden Era, the Gouden Eeuw, as you would say it in Dutch. This pops up in museums, it pops up in people's conversations, and it gets referred to a lot if you're having a lot of conversations with Dutch people. However, being someone from Australia and being someone who didn't grow up here in the Netherlands, I didn't get the history lesson that most people here have received. I have come into it kind of getting a half story, or hearing only the good parts, or hearing only the bad parts. And when I started researching this topic, it is so massive. It is so much bigger than I ever thought it was going to be. There's mentions of tulip mania and the creation of financial bubbles, and this topic just spreads out into a million different funnels. The main point I wanted to make with a video over the VOC is how much wealth the VOC has stolen. How the Dutch have become a wealthy and well-off country due to the impacts and the influence that the VOC had in the 1600s. So before we get into that, I want to break down a little bit better who they are, what they created, and where they went. So some crazy facts that blew my mind about the VOC, or translated into English as the United East India Company, is that not only was it the first multinational corporation to exist, but it is still the biggest, largest to have existed ever. If you counted the wealth of the top 20 companies that exist today, so Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, all of those really big names, their combined wealth is the same as what a single company, the United East India Company, had if they were to convert that wealth into today's money. So we're talking trillions of dollars. The company also existed for about 200 years. So it was set up in 1602 and basically made itself bankrupt 200 years later. A lot of this success was due to the States General of the Netherlands granting it basically a monopoly over the trade industry, which helped it be as successful as it was. During the time that the VOC was being set up, Portugal was actually the country that had the monopoly over a lot of these trade routes at the time. Background into how the Dutch kind of took over: there was wars going on and the Portuguese were unable to fund and maintain their trade lines. There was also a spy system set up by the Dutch government. So they basically planted people in certain positions, and their job was to feed back the Dutch government on where these trade routes went, who was in charge of them, and basically break them down from the inside. The very, very first expedition of the VOC was sent out in 1595. A second expedition was sent out and came back a year later with hundreds of kilos of spices. And the ship basically made a 400% profit for its stakeholders. This was what really piqued the interest in terms of it becoming a public company that was basically funded through shareholders. This led to the company having about 6.4 million euros in today's money to start up their company. This was funded by private stakeholders who had to have a minimum to buy into the company, but essentially gave them a massive foundation to really launch off and start big. Because the company was funded by external stakeholders, they had a massive platform to launch off of. They had the equivalent of 350 million euros as their starting platform, which enabled them to start big straight away. Certain laws were created for United East Indies Company that allowed them to erect forts. It allowed them to seize land. They were allowed to build their own army. They also had permission to sign treaties with local governors and government systems of the countries where they landed. From the get-go, the way the VOC was started up almost acted like its own mini country with these kind of rights and regulations that it had surrounding it. Just like any multinational billion-dollar corporation, the emphasis was on profits. Working for the VOC was terrible conditions. A lot of them had to sign agreements to say that they wouldn't work for other companies. There was a lot of people who died on these voyages. It was super risky work. There was one statistic that I read that said about 1 in 3 sailors that set off actually never made it back home. So now we start kind of diving into the darker side of the United East Indies Company. When I was saying before that they had basically accumulated the wealth of the 20 top companies that we have today, this is wealth that was essentially stolen. The VOC was a driver for colonialism. And although the countries at the time weren't owned by the Netherlands, the way in which the VOC worked and the regulations and the rules that they were given was the beginnings of how colonialism actually commandeered these lands. For example, in Batavia, which was in Indonesia, the VOC began to grow cash crops. And this was the early transition from going from just trading spices and bringing them back to really kind of staying in one place and making money directly from the land that they had kind of claimed. This allowed the VOC to generate a direct profit from lands that they were not the owners of, and lands that they had convinced and signed treaties with local tribes and local people to move off. In order to safeguard a lot of these crops, the VOC began to spread out and create settlements and forts and things to keep other local people out of the area and to make sure that their crops were as profitable as what could be. Essentially, by taking up more land, they really became involved in the internal politics within Jakarta, Batavia, it was then known as, in Indonesia, which sort of led them to create policy changes within the Indonesian government, despite them really claiming that they didn't want to get involved with the governments of places where they had settled. They encouraged a lot of divisions between the islands and territories within Indonesia and kind of created a pathway for themselves to commandeer more land. They also managed to take part in 2 wars that occurred in Indonesia. So like I said earlier, technically this land wasn't owned by the Netherlands at the time, but due to the collapse of the VOC later in the 1800s, this land then became kind of nationalized Dutch land and became called the Dutch East Indies. I think anyone that does a decent amount of research on this subject can quite obviously say that the United East Indies Company had a massive impact on the commercialization of the slave trade. The Netherlands has historically gained its wealth from going over the heads of people from places where they settled. Denial or downplaying this fact doesn't do the people justice, doesn't do the story historically any justice, and I think it's something that should probably be more well recognized in the way that we teach this these days. In 1652, the VOC set up a trading post in what is now known as Cape Hope in South Africa. And they started the beginnings of what is Cape Town. In order to do this, they shipped in thousands and thousands of slaves taken from other parts of Africa and brought them all into this area to essentially help with agriculture and to act as servants to the European settlers that were also brought there to kind of manage the overseeings of the development. The choices that were left for the nomadic groups of people that lived there was either to stay and work for the European settlers or be moved off their lands and their ways and moved away from their culture. Another big factor was bringing in diseases to the area that people had not been exposed to before, so things like smallpox. And I know that there was a lot of this when England actually colonized Australia. Now, I know I really wanted to find out how much worth did the United East Indies Company actually steal, and it is incredibly hard to put a specific number on this. Some of these things were obviously traded, they were swapped for things, and some of the spices and goods that they traded were actually paid for. In terms of the company's wealth, they amounted to about 650 trillion euros in today's money. This is immense, and not all of these objects were stolen. A lot of them were done in trade. But how do you quantify disruption of generations, the stealing of lands, displacement of people's homes and lives, the government rulings and impacts that they had in wars? These things are impossible to quantify. There is no way that you could put a direct value on these things that the VOC also had an influence on. I have read in places that the Rijksmuseum is being more proactive in how the Gouden Eeuw is being seen. They have stopped using the word Gouden Eeuw and referred to it as something else that's been removed from plaques, and it's being removed from painting descriptions and the likes. This is definitely a step in the right direction. VOC essentially went bankrupt in the end by their own doing. For the last, I think, 20 or 30 years, they were basically paying out a higher dividends to what they were actually making in profits. This was kind of accelerated from low interest rates and loaning a lot of money to make it kind of seem that they were still being incredibly successful, but their profit margins had dropped immensely. I definitely think that the people today learn a far more balanced story about what has happened and kind of the business side of the VOC and what that has given us for today in terms of how businesses are set up, but also the atrocities that they caused and the disruption. And I hope that this becomes more of an accepted part of the culture and that it's not seen as the gold standard that I think sometimes it can be portrayed as. I am no historian. I am just curious about Dutch culture, and this seems to play a massive role in it. I will leave the links for anything that I've read or anything that I find that was interesting that contributed to this topic in the description box below. Let me know what you guys think of it. How was the VOC portrayed when you were at school? Do you think that it was only ever sold as a grand tale, or is the dark side of the VOC something that schools are focusing on today? Let me know. I'm always interested in hearing your thoughts. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.